Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I have to tell you, I was in San Diego just about 10 days ago for the scientific sessions of the American Diabetes Association. And not once, not twice, but 5 times, I got stopped saying, "You're Dr. Edelman. It's nice to meet you." But the best one, I was with my wife. We were in an elevator in a parking lot in Jerusalem. And we're coming up the elevator, and this man, and I didn't know him, he looked at me and he says, "I know you." He says, "You're an endocrinologist." I go, "Yeah." And he says, "And you're on the west coast of the United States." I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Dr. Edelman, it's so nice to meet you." And I go, "It's a true story." So I feel sorry for my wife because she has to put up with this all the time. You are in for a treat tonight. I hope some of you may need Kleenex. Let me tell you a little bit about my brother. My brother is 4 years younger than me. We grew up in St. Louis. Anyone here from Missouri, by the way? Any Missourians? Oh, there's some Missourians here. Great. Well, we grew up in St. Louis, and we went to the University of Missouri for college. And actually, my first year of medical school, Jim was a freshman at the University of Missouri Journalism School. And Jim always knew he wanted to be a journalist, although we always thought he was going to be a sports writer. We always thought he'd be writing about the Cardinals, but that's not actually what happened. He then went to graduate school in Austin, Texas. And his mentor down there was somebody that many of you in the audience probably know or know of, and if you don't know her, you should Google her. Her name was Barbara Jordan, Congresswoman Barbara Jordan. And my brother became very close to her. She was the mentor. Amazing stories about Barbara Jordan, this very well-known, very important African-American woman who I believe was the first African-American congresswoman, if I recall correctly. And after that, Jim went along his way. His first job, just not exactly like anybody's first job, he wrote for the New York Times. And boy, were my parents proud when he had his first byline above the fold. But that wasn't enough. He then went to work for the Wall Street Journal as an investigative reporter there. And lo and behold, a few months later, he had his byline above the fold for the Wall Street Journal. Pretty cool. He was with the Journal for 9 years, and then he decided it was time to go and start writing books. Raise your hand if you saw the movie about Reuben Hurricane Carter, starring Denzel Washington. Yeah, so that was my brother's book. That was his first book. And it was pretty amazing. Many of his first books had to deal with the civil rights movement, the African-American struggles, and in fact, the best-selling of these early books, he wrote the biography of Willie Mays, personal friend. And you've never seen a baseball game until you've watched a baseball game with Willie Mays, which I have done. Pretty cool. But in the middle of all this, in his early years, he decided to write a book about diabetes. The name of the book is Cheating Destiny. Raise your hand if you've read Cheating Destiny. A lot of you. I have a feeling at the end of this talk, those of you who did not raise your hand are going to be very interested in reading this book, because some really interesting things happened when he decided to write this book about diabetes called Cheating Destiny. And I'm just going to leave it at that, and you will hear all about what happened when he was writing the book and then what happened after the book was written as we fast forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my little brother, James Hirsch.
Thank you very much. I don't know that I'll get a eulogy that nice, so that's I appreciate that. Goodness. Last year, I received a call one night. I live on the East Coast. I live in the Boston area. I received a call one night from Steve, actually because of the hour difference. He actually woke me up, and he introduced himself, and he said that he was putting together this great conference, and he asked me if I'd be willing to speak at it. I said, of course, I'd be honored. And I asked Steve, well, what do you want me to talk about? And he just said, well, just tell your story. And I was thinking about that this afternoon when I was at the taco bar and just being in this audience here. Every one of you has a story to tell, and it's just as important or as good as my story. And the thing about a conference like this, I know most of the panelists whom you'll see tomorrow and on Sunday, and it's a fantastic group. So you're going to learn a lot and have a great time. But really the value of this, and Steve mentioned this and Jeremy did, the value is that all these people have come together and you get a chance to meet each other and interact and just share your stories with each other. That's the great thing about this conference. And so I'm going to share with you my story. So as Earl mentioned, I'm a journalist and an author, and a number of years ago, I wanted to write a book about diabetes. And I was going to use, the book wasn't going to be autobiographical, but I was going to have my personal experience inform the book. So I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 1977. I was 15. I was pretty old compared to when Earl was diagnosed. And I was always fortunate because I always had good doctors, good health care, the best products available. And of course, Earl was my older brother. As one of Earl's friends said, he was pre-med in 6th grade. So I always had someone there to look out for me. And so I was going to write this book, and I knew when I was young, even though that I had all these advantages, I still knew about the challenges of diabetes. A couple of years after I was diagnosed, I was watching the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite one night. And he was introducing a segment about juvenile diabetes. That's what they called it back then. And Cronkite said that if you have juvenile diabetes, you have a 50-50 chance of reaching age 40. 50-50. It was a coin toss. Now, I knew my chances were better than 50-50, but it was still an important comment that he made because I kind of knew then, and I would know more over the years about the context of that comment. And the context is basically this. Diabetes was first discovered or recognized some 2,000 years ago. And for most of that 2,000 years, if you got diabetes, we had no way of treating it. If you got diabetes, you died. That was your fate. That was your destiny. Now, all that changed in 1921 when we discovered insulin. Now, at the time, the newspaper headlines hailed insulin as a miracle cure. Now, it wasn't a miracle cure. It was a treatment. It was a therapy, and it could allow you to live, but it was a pretty crude therapy. And so over the next 50 years, I think this was the bamboo stage that Jeremy talked about. Over the next 50 years, the tools got a little bit better. The insulins got a little bit better. The syringes got a little bit better. Our knowledge got a little bit better. So that by the time I was diagnosed in 1977, things were better, but still not very advanced. And in fact, so when I was diagnosed, we were still using Clinatest. So if you want to know what your blood sugar was, you would test to see how much sugar was in your urine. Now, if you thought about it, it made no sense. So we didn't think about it. We just did it. That was the key to diabetes care in the old days. What I didn't know at the time, in the late 1970s, was that this was really an important inflection point in the history of diabetes, and that we then just were able to figure out how to do home glucose monitoring, how to test your blood sugar at home. It began with these things, the BG chem strips. And obviously, some of you recall them. You would put a drop of blood on this strip, and it would tell you what your blood sugar was by the color. Now I recall when I was a freshman in college. Earl references this a moment ago. I was a freshman in 1980. I remember these chem strips, you would cut them up into thirds, so one vial would last you the whole semester. And so, like on the Saturday night, my friends were getting ready to go out, and I'm trying to figure out what color I was, and that's how we rolled back then. Now, these chem strips were then followed by the actual monitor, or the meter. Now, this is an old-fashioned one. I never used this. But I do recall, and I think Jeremy referenced this, the meters that you put a drop of blood on it, it would take 60 seconds to get a number. And then the next generation, it took 30 seconds. And this was a huge advance. And then, so I'm just fast forward to where we are today. And where we are today, of course, is unbelievable technology. The meters, very small and sleek. And of course, if you're the meter company, your blood sugar is always 104. It's cool how that works. And so we have great meters, and the insulins are unbelievable. We went from the animal-based insulins to the human to the synthetic. So now they're better, faster, purer, and they're getting better all the time, including the Afrezza, which is available. And then all of the technology, the kinds of stuff that you see in the room out there, the small insulin pumps, the CGMs, the ability to download data, things you're going to hear about tomorrow with closing the loop and the artificial pancreas, all of this stuff. And things that we don't really talk all that much about is just how much more we know and understand about diabetes than we used to know in terms of nutrition and exercise and stress and all the things that can affect blood sugar. So that has been this last 25 years a remarkable history. And so I was going to write a book that talked about it, but I wasn't going to write a book in a sort of a triumphant tone, because it's not really something to be triumphant about, at least the way I see it, and if you live with it, probably the way you understand it. What is diabetes? Diabetes occurs when your body is incapable of performing its most essential function, converting food into energy. And nothing that they've invented out there has cured that. And so from my perspective, the way I saw it is that as a matter of biology, as a matter of evolution, we still shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here. The way I saw it is that all the stuff that we have out there that allows us to do this, each day I'm just cheating my fate. I'm cheating destiny. And so that was going to be what my book was going to be about. It was going to be just sort of tracing this evolution of care, this transformation of care in the context of this struggle and the journey that patients have been on throughout the millennium. But something happened to my book. There was a little bit of a wrinkle. So I was working on it in the summer of 2004, and we have 2 kids. And at the time, our daughter Amanda was age 6, and Garrett was age 3. And toward the end of the summer, Garrett came up to me and said that he was thirsty. And now he was a very active kid, and so he was always rehydrating, with water and juice. So I was thinking, well, maybe it's okay. But he kept coming back to me saying he was thirsty, and of course I know that that's a symptom. And then finally one night in sort of late September, he comes into our bedroom around midnight, and he says he's not feeling well, he has a bellyache, and he's not really looking good. And so I pull out my meter, and I test his blood sugar, and the reading comes back high, HI. And my first thought, true story, was that it's telling me hello, like hi. I thought, well, that's kind of an odd thing for a glucose meter to say. And then I realized, no, it's not hi as in hello, it's hi as in your blood sugar is high, H-I-G-H. And my thought was, these meter companies make millions of dollars from us, but they can't afford all 4 letters. They got to change that. So The first thing I did was I called Earl in Seattle, and I told him what happened. And he said, well, Jimmy, you got to take him to the hospital. And so I packed up Garrett, and I put him in the car, and we drove, through the dead of night to Children's Hospital in Boston, the world-renowned Children's Hospital. That's what it says on the website. And so we got to the ER, and we walked in there, and there was a woman there, and I explained to her what happened, and she said her first question was, "Do you have insurance?" I said, "Yes, I've got insurance." She said, "Come on in." And so that's a true story, and so we go in, and so again, Garrett's 3 years old, and they tried to put an IV in his arm, and because he was so small, they had a hard time finding a vein, so they kept jabbing him. And Garrett kept saying, that hurts, and I really didn't kind of know how to explain it to him. I said, well, Garrett, you have a boo-boo in your belly, and we just have to make it better. So they finally got the IV in, and they drew the blood, and he was 550. And so they gave him some insulin, and the following morning he woke up and he was 279, and I didn't feel sad at that moment. But my thought was, this true story, is that 90 years ago he'd be lying on his deathbed, but now he's cheating destiny like the rest of us. That morning, my wife came to relieve me, Cheryl, and I went home, and I cleaned up, and I came back to the hospital. I took Garrett into the playroom, and we saw this girl there. She was like 11, 12 years old, and she walks up to Garrett, and she says, "My brother has cystic fibrosis. What do you have?" And Garrett says, "I have diabetes." And I looked at him. I couldn't believe he even knew that word. And unknown to me, Cheryl had told him what he had. And when he said it, though, it was like his first adult word. And I thought, oh, damn, his childhood is over. And so off we went. So here... That was the first Sunday that we were back. He went to a soccer practice, and we didn't really have any game plan or any master strategy. Even though I had type 1, for much of my life, and my brother, was my brother, every day was just kind of, we improvised. And that first year was hard. I mean, Garrett didn't like it. He didn't like getting the shots, and he would run around the house, and I would chase him with the syringe, and he would say, "I hate diabetes," and sometimes I'd have to hold him down to give him his injection. But one of the things I started doing then is I get, particularly after I would give him a shot, I would say, "Garrett, I'm very proud of you. Do you know why? Because you're very brave." And I don't know how much that helped, but that was just kind of my way of acknowledging, kind of his experience. Now, it was a team effort, and those of you who are part of families with diabetes, you already know this. It doesn't matter how old you are; it's a team effort. And in our case, I was kind of a night owl, so I would test Garrett's blood sugar between midnight and 2 a.m. Cheryl was and is an early morning person, so she had the early morning shift. And then Amanda, she would keep track of the numbers. And then to round out the team, we got a dog, and that's the cockapoo. Now, her job is to be a dog, so she's got the best job in the house. I think one of our biggest challenges in the early days was Garrett's diet. So Garrett didn't like vegetables and wouldn't eat vegetables. And he didn't even like protein. Like he wouldn't eat like chicken and hot dogs. Most things that kids like. Garrett liked carbs, pizza, spaghetti, sandwiches. And so what we would do in the face of these high-carb meals is afterwards we would do wind sprints. We'd go outside and run up and down the street. Or when we go to a restaurant, we would run in the parking lot or down alleys or down the sidewalk. We'd go to hotels. We'd run up and down the hotel rooms. And then the problem was in the winter in Boston, it was too cold to go outside. So Garrett and I would go on the bed and we would play football. I'd give him the pillow, and he would have to run past me, and he'd run past me, and I would grab him, and I'd pick him up, and with all my might, I would body slam him onto the mattress, and he would squeal with delight. He thought we were playing a game. I was trying to get him under 220, and that was... That's how we did it. I became very sensitive to the language that was used, not just by me or by Cheryl, but by adults around us, including Garrett's doctor. The first meeting we had with Garrett's doctor, a pediatric endocrinologist, very well regarded in Boston. He was taking our family history, and so we told him we had a daughter, and he asked us, "Well, is she healthy?" And I was really struck by that question because I knew he was asking, "Well, does she have diabetes, or does she have any other medical condition?" And I've had type 1 for 40 years, and there's never been a day in my life when I thought I was unhealthy. And I kind of bristle at that notion that anyone would, but more importantly, it's not about me, it was about our kid. And the last thing I would want Garrett to ever see himself as or consider himself as is being unhealthy. And so I told the doctor, no, our daughter's healthy. And we got a new doctor by the end of the year. I was struck by how much both of our kids picked up on just this whole diabetes thing. So as I mentioned, Garrett was on 2 shots in the early days. And one day he comes home from preschool and he says to us, my teacher told me that her uncle has diabetes. And Amanda is right there, and she says, type 1 or type 2? Well, we had never explained to Amanda the difference between type 1 and type 2, but she had overheard us talking about it. So Garrett is standing right there, and he says, I have type 2. I said, Garrett, why do you think you have type 2? And he says, well, I have it in the morning, and I have it in the evening. That's when he had his shots. We were fortunate that when Garrett went to elementary school, he had a wonderful school nurse, which isn't always the case. I hear a lot of stories from parents where that's a huge challenge, the support from the school. But this nurse, she was an Irish woman, Mrs. Graham, and she adored Garrett, and they had a beautiful rapport. And when Garrett was in 3rd grade in the school, they brought in a gentleman who was confined to a wheelchair. And he came in to talk about what it was like to be disabled, to have a disability. And he spoke to the entire student body. After his presentation, Garrett went to the nurse's office. And he asked Mrs. Graham, he says, am I disabled? And the question took Mrs. Graham by surprise, and she said, well, in the eyes of some people, you may be disabled, but it doesn't matter what other people say or think about you. All it matters is what you think about yourself. And Garrett said, okay, and he turned around and left. The only reason I knew about that story was that Mrs. Graham then called me and told me about the conversation. Garrett never said anything about it. But I think that kind of feedback was really helpful to to us, to Cheryl and me, as we try to encourage Garrett, basically to not let diabetes be a hindrance. So Garrett was like any other kid. He played sports, and he always did that and loved sports. When he was 7 years old, he went to Camp Joslin outside of Boston. The camp was founded in like 1933. It's still going strong. But he was 7 years old, really young. And it was an overnight camp. And so when we dropped him off, Cheryl cried. I came home. I sent Earl an email. I said, my God, he's so young. Is this going to work? Earl sent me an email back. He said, don't worry. He'll be fine. Have a drink. And the funny thing, he told me the same thing tonight. Nothing's changed. So he had a great time at Camp Joslin. He got his first insulin pump when he was like in first grade, and that worked out really well. But then when Garrett was 10 years old, we had this other kind of threshold moment. Garrett wanted to go to the same sleepaway camp that Amanda went to, which of course was a non-diabetes camp. And we were really nervous about this because while the camp had kids with diabetes before, they had never had a kid who was only 10 years old, someone so young. And so there was a lot of back and forth between me and the camp and whether this could work and everything that had to be done. But Garrett was adamant. This is really what he wanted to do. So Garrett went to camp, and he had a great time. And he had a great time his first year and every year after that. But we still had our challenges. The second or third night Garrett was there his first year, the camp nurse called me. And she said, Mr. Hirsch, Garrett's numbers are all over the place. What's wrong? I said, his pancreas doesn't work. That's what's wrong. And she said, that's not good enough. And so we worked it out. There was a staff member there who was a former EMT who each night would go into the cabin after Garrett went to sleep and was test his blood sugar. And through all of that great support, he's been able to go to that camp throughout all of these years. I learned a lot about diabetes through Garrett. When Garrett was 10 years old, he was interviewed by a filmmaker for a documentary about kids with diabetes. And the filmmaker came over to the house, and she's filming him, and she says, Garrett, what is the worst thing about diabetes? And Garrett starts talking to her about this birthday party that he went to and pizza and cake. And what happened was Garrett went to a birthday party. It was at a bowling alley. And after they got done bowling, they served pizza and cake. And I was supposed to show up at that time and test Garrett's blood sugar and bolus him. But there was a miscommunication about the time. And so I wasn't there. And the mother, she was well-intentioned, but she sat Garrett to the side, and she served the pizza and the cake to all the other kids, and Garrett had to sit there and watch. And to Garrett, that was the worst thing about having diabetes. Now, what Garrett didn't tell the filmmaker was that that birthday party had been 3 years ago. But it was still the worst thing. And if you were to ask him today, he would still tell you that was the worst thing about diabetes. But what it made me think about, though, was that the doctors will tell you that diabetes is a chronic condition. And I don't believe that's true. I think diabetes is only a disease when it intervenes in your life in some way. And if it prevents you from doing something that you wanted to do, that's when it's a condition. Otherwise, I don't believe it's a chronic disease. When Garrett was in 6th grade, he was playing baseball, and he was out in center field. He gets a fly ball, and he dropped the ball. Now, Garrett is not the second coming of Mike Trout, but he's a good little player, and it's a ball he normally catches. And so it was kind of odd that he dropped it. And then the next inning, he came to bat, and he struck out. And then the game was over. And he comes off the field, and I could tell something was wrong. And he tells me in this voice, kind of really intense voice, he said, I'm low. And his blood sugar was low. And that contributed to these plays. I said, Garrett, I'm sitting here, I've got juice boxes, I've got glucose tabs, I've got glucagon, I've got enough glycemic stuff to raise the blood sugar of a small army. Why don't you tell me you're low and I can help you out. But of course, no. I mean, no, he's not going to take himself out of the game because his blood sugar is low and bring attention to himself. So he was really upset. And so we go into the car, and he sits in the car. And it had been a long day. He actually had 2 games that day. So we'd been outside for many hours, been in the sun a long time. And he's a really competitive kid. He hates to lose, and he hates to play poorly. And just everything just kind of came crashing down on him. And he started to cry. And this is a kid that never cries. But it was just, he was so upset that because of diabetes, he made these errors and these plays in the field. So I thought about a couple things then. I heard this story, it's secondhand, but it's one of the best stories I've heard about sort of diabetes and insights into this disease. And the story is there's this guy, he has type 1 diabetes, and he's an umpire for his daughter's softball game. And he has a bad low blood sugar experience, and he needs help on the field. And it's a humiliating experience to have to be assisted in front of all these girls. And so he's talking to his doctor, and he says, the problem with diabetes is that all of your successes are private, and all of your failures are public. So you think about it. If Garrett wakes up at 104, no one's going to know about it. If he has an A1C of 6.5, well, his doctor may know and I may know, but who else would even care? It's not like hitting a home run in baseball where you get mobbed at home plate. It just happens. Whereas if you have a low blood sugar experience that brings attention to yourself, or if you end up in the ER, or if you have a complication of some sort, well, then it's public, and everyone knows about it. And that's a really tough thing about it, and I don't have a good answer for it. But I was talking about this to a doctor. I don't know if he's here tonight, although he's here this weekend, Dr. Howard Wolpert. I was talking to him about this challenge, and he gave me some really great advice. He said, the thing about diabetes that you should keep in mind is this. When you have a good day, you take credit for it. When you have a bad day, you blame the disease and you say you'll do better tomorrow. So that's what I did with Garrett as he's sitting there in the car crying. I said, Garrett, there are just some days where the disease is going to get the better of you. And there's some innings where the disease is going to get the better of you. But that's okay, because tomorrow it's another day, it's another game, the score is 0, and we'll just move on. And I also told him, I said, Garrett, I'm very proud of you. You know why? Because you're very brave. And then parenthetically, I'll mention with Dr. Wolpert was that he said to me, the most important thing about diabetes and teenage kids is just the goal is to survive. What he didn't tell me was that for non-diabetes kids and teenagers, the most important goal is to survive. So it's just, it's just stuff that we learn. So we continued on. So Garrett had a normal childhood. He continued going to this summer camp. He went to all the parties. He always got along well with his big sister. He continued to play sports. And then when he was going into his freshman year in high school, we had kind of another one of these threshold moments. He comes to us and he says that he wants to play football. Now, Garrett's never played football in his life. And he's not that big of a kid. And I don't really love the idea of football in general because the game is such a high risk for injury. But in this case, it was also because of having the type 1. Now, normally when Garrett would come to me and say he wanted to do something, I would never talk about diabetes as a reason he should reconsider it. But in this case, I was very up front with him. I said, if you have a low blood sugar experience in baseball and you strike out, well, so what? It's just a game. But if you're 54 and you're playing football, the guy on the other line, the side of the line of scrimmage doesn't know you're 54, and he's going to throttle you. Do you really want to take that risk? He said, no, yeah, I want to do it, Dad. I want to do it. And so we agreed that he would do it, and he promised that he would always test his blood sugar before each practice and before each game, and off he played. So here he was this year, that's his JV season as a sophomore, and there's another picture. And so, knock on wood, he hasn't gotten hurt in the 2 years that he's played, and he absolutely loves it. He's passionate about football. It's his whole life. The team's really good. He's pretty good, and it's a strange sport. The team, it has a great strength and conditioning program, and the discipline is great, and the teamwork is wonderful, and the camaraderie, everything about the sport is great except the sport, but that's what you sign up for. But knock on wood, again, so far so good. Now we've come upon another threshold moment, which is the day after tomorrow, on Sunday, Garrett gets on an airplane. And he's going to be flying to Israel, and he's going to be there for 5 weeks. And this is part of the camp that he goes to. When you reach age 16, they send you to Israel. And it's not like you go there and you sit on the beach for 5 weeks. They have a very robust schedule. You travel all over the country doing all kinds of things to experience it. And as I'm sure many of you know, when you travel overseas, it's complicated because of the time difference and the food and all the rest. And so there was never any question that Garrett was going to go on it, but we really wanted Garrett to use a CGM. A kid with type 1 went on this trip last year, and he had CGM, and he said it was like a lifesaver for him because the schedule is so chaotic and the food is unpredictable, and as many of you know that the CGM is a really valuable tool. But 2 years ago, Garrett actually stopped using the insulin pod, the pods, and went to pens, which is fine. And he did it in part because the pods were beginning to have some skin irritation and stuff. But the main reason was that he's a 16-year-old kid, and he doesn't want things attached to his body anymore. And he doesn't want the CGM attached to his body. So that's kind of what he looks like now. And he, like a lot of teenagers, no, don't, please. But he likes the way he looks without his shirt on, and he doesn't want things attached to his body. It recalls an event that happened maybe 7 or 8 years ago. I went to a JDRF research update in Boston, and they brought in a researcher who was doing clinical trials on CGM at the time, which very few kids or teenagers were using it then. I don't even know if they had FDA approval. And so this guy comes in, and he's got all of his charts and graphs and the algorithmic analysis all showing that this technology works and kids should be on it. And a woman raises her hand, and she says, I have 2 teenage girls with type 1, and they both wear an insulin pump, but they don't want to do CGM because in the summer, they wear bikinis, and there's only so much real estate. And that was the phrase she used. And so she says to the researcher, she said, well, what should I tell them? And the researcher said, I'm not making this up, he said, well, tell them to buck up, B-U-C-K, buck up. And you could hear this gasp from all the parents in the audience, because as if he's unaware about what it's like to have teenage girls. And sometimes the researchers become so enamored with their technology is that they forget that they're actually people who are using this stuff. And so it's not that like a teenage girl in a bikini or a kid who goes to Israel who doesn't want to wear the stuff. It's not that they're bad kids. It's not even that they're vain. It's just that there are other things in their lives that are more important to them at that moment than their blood sugar. And so even though with Garrett, I was frustrated, and Earl helped me on this to no avail, but to try to get Garrett to use a CGM, he was adamant against it. But we did find a compromise. So he wouldn't use the Dexcom because that was too big. But there's this other product out, which some of you may have heard of. It's called the Freestyle Libre. It's not approved in the United States. It's approved in Europe, but it's a sensor about the size of a thick quarter, and it's very discreet so that you can put it on your arm, and very few people will see it, even if your shirt's not on. Now, it has downsides compared to the other CGMs because there's no alarm for lows. And that's one of the main benefits of a CGM is that if you start to crash, you'll hear, and other people will hear. So it's not exactly what we would want, but it's what Garrett's going to use. And so one other note about his trip, the organizers of this trip to Israel asked all the parents to write a note for their child that they will give to the child on the first Shabbat in Israel. And you just say something about, we hope you're having a great time in Israel, and you're learning a lot about the culture and the history and all the rest. So I've written a note for Garrett, and it says, "Dear Garrett, I'm very proud of you. Do you know why? Because you're very brave." Now, knowing Garrett, he's going to send me a postcard back and says, "Dear Dad, I've joined the Army. Deal with it." What became of the book? So the book, Cheating Destiny, was published 10 years ago. This is not my family. The publisher had to hire a better-looking family than we were. And it chronicled the first year of Garrett's life with diabetes, as well as covering a lot of the other things that I was planning to write about. I think one difference was that when I was doing research on the book, I was talking to some of the researchers for the cure. And I think in light of Garrett's diagnosis, I was kind of impatient with them. I was saying, oh, damn it, what have you people been doing all these years? Why haven't you cured it? But I'll just share with you one last story, and then we'll move on to the next phase of the night. A couple of years ago, Garrett and I were in the car, and we were listening to NPR, and they had a story about stem cell research. And it's about how this could cure all kinds of diseases, including diabetes. And so after the segment was over, Garrett asked me, well, how would that work? And so I tried to explain it to him as best I could. And we're just kind of driving along, and he's looking out the window, and he says, well, if they did have a cure, would you want one? I said, if they cured diabetes, would I want to be cured? He said, yeah. I said, well, yeah, sure. I said, what about you? And he says, I don't really think so. I said, really? You won't be cured? And he says, well, it's different with you. He said, you remember what it was like before you had diabetes. We said, this is all I've known. And I've heard teenage kids with diabetes say before that that they were glad they got type 1 because it made them a better person. It made them more resilient. It made them stronger. It made them more patient. It made them more compassionate. It made them more empathetic. And all that's true. I don't think that's how Garrett sees it. I don't think Garrett sees that it made him a better person. I think the way he sees it is that it just made him who he is today. and that's good enough. So, did it end his childhood? No, of course not. His was a fun, boisterous, loving, at times challenging, but never dull childhood. My only regret is that we can't do it again. So that's my story. Thank you.